Hello everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's For Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Multi-Layered Authorship on authors, artists, patrons, and Apocrypha in the Western tradition. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube Live from ForSpace, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At ForSpace, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine research questions and projects in development here at the university. We are running today's event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions using the raised hand function or via the chat if you're joining by Zoom. And for those of you here in the space, if you'd like to participate, you can just let us know by raising a hand and we'll be sure to get a microphone to you. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Professor of Classics, Modern Languages, and Linguistics, Dr. Dario Brancato. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Fourth Space. So the topic of that I've chose for today has something to do with my SSHRC-funded project, which is the Italian Art of Political Correctness. And I started approaching this this topic by looking at different histories written in the 16th century in Florence, where there was something that did not jive correctly, especially these histories at some point were tampered with. So I started coming up with the idea of who is the real author of this histories. And so I'm just wrapping my head around this concept of an authorship that is not monolithic, and it's actually something more layered. And so I came up with the idea of multi-layered authorship. And this is not just something that has to do with the past. More recent examples include, for example, think of the movie Spartacus, 1960 movie directed by Stanley Kubrick. Or was it Stanley Kubrick? Because the actual director was Anthony Mann, who at some point decided to walk out of the project after shooting most of the scenes. Then what's his name? Then Kubrick walks in and finishes the movie. And so the concept of authorship, who's the real responsible for the movie is, as we can see, is quite complex. Even in modern days, even in days after the concept of author and the concept of copyright has been shaped very strongly by the legal definition of copyright. So today I'll be joined by three colleagues. So we'll have Pablo Celi, who will be talking from Florence and is live on Zoom right now. Brad Nelson, who would talk about Apocrypha in Don Quixote, and finally Kristin Franseen about music, rivalries, and so on. So the conversation will be very casual, so feel free to ask. So the format will be the following: each of us will do a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll leave the floor open for discussion. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to start my presentation, which has to do with multi-layered authorship and historiography. Now, what is multi-layered authorship? So it's a concept that it's a little bit of that has like several layers of complexity, to say no pun intended. So first of all, we have to take a step back and go all the way to the Middle Ages. So who was an author in the Middle Ages? The author was someone who gave authority to a text. And so oftentimes we'll have texts that would be attributed to an author, but in fact were written by more obscure people. But the first people that started self-fashioning as authors were during the by the end of the Middle Ages and at the beginning of the humanism period, two Italians, Dante, of course, who would portray himself as an author, but even more so Petrarch. Petrarch, who would assume a persona of an author, like a public persona that he would use to self-fashion as an author. And so this is like the very beginning of the modern concept of authorship, which, as I said before, was shaped and was like strongly influenced by the law on copyright that came out in the 18th century, the first definition of copyright, and the romantic idea of author, that has to be someone who's like uniquely responsible for the piece of art that they're making. And of course, there is a great deal of literature on the subject. We cannot but think of Roland Barthes, who in 1967 wrote *The Death of the Author*, a very fundamental essay on the irrelevance, in a way, of the tendency to include the life of the author in the interpretation of their works. But also we have like new tendencies and new trends in critical theories that take into account the response of the reader towards a text and towards an author. So in a way, we could say, does it matter who the author is? Because the author is dead. Why focusing on authorship? Well, in my case, and in the case that I'm presenting today, in the case that I'm presenting today, we need to focus on a different genre, which is not literature. So it's not literature, it's not poetry, it's not fictional literature, but it's history. So the historian has a duty, and the duty of the historian is to tell the truth, or at least, to make things look as they were truthful. So, in other words, historiography and history is a liminal genre. It can be literature at times, but it has to stick to the truthfulness of documents. So things make even more sense when we talk about official history. An official history is, by definition, a history that is paid for by the ruler. And we have the tendency to mistake official history with propaganda. It's not exactly propaganda, because propaganda might be conceived and perceived as something false. So historians are people that are required, at least in the Renaissance, there are people who were required to work within the field of truth, what Bernard Williams defines as the field of truth. And in a way, it is true that history is a form of literature. We have several modern essays that define the genre in the early modern, but even earlier in the late Middle Ages. Not just chronicling, but also presenting sort of a dossier of documents that would at least give the ruler sort of an insurance that his power is legitimate. And this is the reason that prompted me to investigate the case study I'm going to talk about today. And it's the case study of the official histories of Florence that were commissioned by the first Duke of Florence. Not the very first Duke of Florence, but let's say the first Medici Duke that established a dynasty. Now, we have a a nice family tree here of the Medici dynasty. And these are all people that you are, if you know about Italian history, you might have heard of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lawrence the Magnificent, or even two popes, Leo X, Clement VII. So very important and prominent figures in the Renaissance. But unfortunately, the duke that established the dynasty did not come from this branch of the family. So that was a problem of legitimacy, of power legitimacy. Now, just to give you a little more context, what happened in Florence? Florence was, up until 1530, a republic. So even though the other Medici that we saw in the previous slide ruled the city as the de facto rulers, the institution of Florence was a republic. So the republic was toppled in 1530, and the emperor, Charles V, decided that the republic should not be a republic anymore. Instead, it had to be a duchy. So he put a duke there. His name was Alessandro, so the last offspring of the branch, the family tree that we just saw. And he decided that his successors were to rule in Florence as the legitimate dukes. Problem is that Alessandro was murdered before having legitimate offspring. And so there was an institutional crisis in Florence. What happened was that one distant cousin, pictured to the right, Cosimo, was elected as Duke of Florence. And the big shot families of the time thought that this would be a way of controlling the state without having to worry too much about a legitimate successor. But Cosimo was smart. He outsmarted, all this big cheeses, and he concentrated the power under his rule. And so he was able to create a very successful cultural, political, economic politics that, in fact, helped him establish himself as the ruler of the city. And so there was a problem. He had to show the world that he was a legitimate ruler. So how do you do so? You do so by hiring historians, people that will write the history of your city in a light that would present you as the legitimate ruler. And so just to give you an example, here's the other branch of the family tree. So you can see that Cosimo is on the right side, and whereas all the other people that we saw earlier are on the left side. So they were like distant relatives who even had the stigma of being called the popular people, because they would tend to associate themselves with the populace, not with the nobles. And so the case study I'm going to talk about today will include 3 authors that they were hired as official historians of Florence during Cosimo's rule. The first one, his name was Benedetto Varchi, and he was. We can see that there is a trend here with all these historians. He was trained as a poet and as a humanist, not as a historian. So, and what is more interesting is that he was formerly a supporter of the Republic. So it was like a sort of a reformed Republican who later joined the cause of the Duke. And he was appointed, like completely out of the blue, to write this history of Florence. So he comes up with this very ambitious plan to write a history of the city that would focus on the years of the last Republic of Florence, the last popular Republic of Florence, 1527 to 1530. Varchi died in 1565 and left a huge amount of manuscripts, notes, plans, etc., but he never got to finish the history that it was appointed to write. But the history, nevertheless, will be published in 1721. Now, you might wonder, who put these papers together? And this is, I'll let this as a suspense. So, in order to understand what happens here, one has to, dig into the papers and the documents and the dirt, what I call the dirt of history. You have to get your hands dirty by digging into older documents and try to come up and try to think also as the historian would think. So if you try to put all the papers in a row, you realize that there were at least 4 different projects, and each of them would expand and would get bigger and bigger and bigger. And one might suspect that the Duke of Florence, that Cosimo would give the author advice, but in fact it was more than advice. He would actually request them to continue. At some point, Varchi had finished at the end of the events, focusing on 1532. He said, okay, I'm finished with my work. The Duke says, no, you have to continue. So he imposed him to continue writing his history. But this is not the end of it. So here you can see one of the many mind maps that he came about with. This is not the end of it, but before getting into how this historical works transitioned from being manuscript works into printed works, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 2 other historians. The second historian's name was Giovan Battista Adriani, again, another former Republican who was hired to write a history of Florence that would continue Varchi's history, and that he managed to finish it by the last year of his life. And again, he would talk about the way Cosimo has established and consolidated his power. And finally, we have a third historian who was hired in the final years of Cosimo's life in 1570. His name was Scipione Ammirato. So once again, not a politician. If we see histories before Varchi and up to the first half of the 16th century, all of these historians were former politicians. Think of Machiavelli, for example. They were people that were involved into politics. Now we see a shift in the intellectual role of the historian. Not longer a politician, but someone who would be a poet, a humanist, and in this case, a professional historian. So Ammirato will be the first professional historian of Florence. And he wrote sort of a definitive history of Florence that came out in 1600, and then the second volume, we'll see why, came out in 1641. Now, why were these works printed at very odd times? We saw Varchi printed in 1721, Ammirato's second volume printed in 1641. There was a reason to that. Well, the reason has to do with censorship. So censorship became tighter and tighter. First, on a religious level. So as you may be familiar with, 1558 marked the publication of the Index of the Prohibited Books, an index that was revised in 1564. But Florence had enjoyed some kind of freedom. As long as Cosimo was alive, he wouldn't be bothered by these inquisitors that came from Rome. Say, you know what? Forget it. I just do things the way I like them to be done. But in 1573, 1 year before Cosimo died, a synod in Florence said, well, we need to stick to what the Inquisition says. And there is a struggle between religious and secular power that, as a result, ended up in significant delays in the publication of works. And this, ended at the end of the century with, skirmishes between the Duke, the Grand Duke at this point, and the Inquisitors. But anyway, this is a different story. Now, we'll see what the afterlife of this works was. So, as you can see from this slide, all three works were revised after the author's death. But revision meant even altering the composition of the work. So let's go into details and see very briefly, because I'm just going beyond my time, what happened concretely. So if we take Varchi's history, we can say that all the sensitive political passages, as well as religious themes, were censored, but not censored by an anonymous person. These passages would be edited by the Duke himself. And then on the right-hand side, you have the handwriting on the Duke on the manuscript that Varchi produced, writing about, giving advice on how to edit. The note on the side said, "Get to the point. Say this in fewer words." Moral themes would be also slashed, as well as digressions. And the two people that carried out this work, again, after Varchi's death, were the Duke himself and his personal physician. So that's Cosimo's handwriting. And so his personal physician, whose name was Baccio Baltini, who also happened to like history and was a librarian himself, on top of being a physician. Now, with Adriani, we see similar levels of censorship. So we can see that the author, in this case, blends with the state and religious apparatus. So, but it's a form of censorship that comes from two directions. One is the family of the author that corrects the style of the work. And the other layer of censorship is state censorship. In fact, we can see, this is a page of the book, on the bottom left side, there is a sort of a signature that looks like a squiggle, but it's actually the officer that would give permission to print the book. So it would be an officer of the Medici entourage that would pretty much, approve, but also, can you see, I don't think you can see the line that goes that kind of crosses out the entire passage. That's also his handwriting. So he takes the liberty to edit things out and to decide what passages should and should not be published. With Ammirato, we have a similar situation, only that on the printed book, we see, can you see all those stars? It's not a reproduction of a starry night, but it's actually the religious censorship. The Inquisition at some point got stuck and said, no, you cannot print this unless we have this passage removed. So the idea that I'm wrapping my head around is, what is an author at this time? And if we want to talk about these histories, who do we credit? The author, but the author was dead. And how do we consider the fact that for centuries we've been reading these histories as a result of a collaboration, an imposition, and a form of censorship. And I finished my presentation here, so I'd like to give the word to Paolo, and thank you very much for listening.
Hello. Thank you, Dario, for inviting me. Thank you for having me here. I'll just share my screen so I can start my presentation. So So the painting, I will be talking about a painting, and the painting I'm talking about today is by Bronzino, who signed it in the lower left corner of the painting. So you can see here his signature, Bronzino F, that is Bronzino Florentine, a mid-16th century artist in the service of the Duke of Florence, Cosimo I. In fact, the painting that Dario was showing, the portrait of Cosimo I, was actually made by Bronzino. The first record of this painting I'm showing you is in an early 18th century inventory of the Arese collection in Milan, where it is listed as a portrait of Petrarch's Laura, that is the muse of Francesco Petrarca, the 14th century poet, taken as the model for early modern Italian and European lyric poetry. This identification may have been influenced not only by the fact that the woman is holding an open book with two of Petrarch's sonnets, but perhaps also by the pose in profile, unusual in the 16th century and absolutely unique in Bronzino's portraits. A pose that must have been perceived as primitive, since the compiler of the Arese inventory went so far as to say that Laura was represented according to her vera effigie traslata, according to an iconographic tradition dating back 2 centuries, from the 16th to the original 14th century portrait of Laura, which has never been found, and which Petrarch claims to have commissioned from a painter friend, the Sienese Simone Martini. This identification held for almost 200 years. In the early 19th century, an engraving of Bronzino's painting was chosen for the frontispiece of a Milanese edition of Petrarch's Rime, until it was challenged by Gustav Wagen in 1870. Wagen did not believe that the woman's features resembled those of Laura, and I would be curious, I would love to know which picture he based this argument on. Bronzino was more likely to have portrayed one of his contemporaries, Vittoria Colonna, the most celebrated woman writer of the time, who was also a friend of Michelangelo, and Bronzino, according to Wagen, was a pupil of Michelangelo. Wagen did not explain what in the painting made him think of a writer, but the change is not trivial. We have moved from the portrait of the beloved to that of a poet in her own right. Wagen's hypothesis was revived in 1903 by Neustroyev, who recognized the same fine protruding note, this is a quote from Neustroyev, in the portrait of Vittoria Colonna in the Uffizi. You can judge. And even more so in the medals with the woman's profile in the Museum's Mazzucchellianum. So here's the medals, and there's a zoom on the medals. And please bear in mind the reference to medals, as I will return to them at the end of my presentation. The last owner of the painting was the collector, art historian, and critic Charles Loesser, who bought it in London and brought it back to Italy, first to his private residence at Villa Gattaia in Florence, and then as a gift to the city, along with some 30 other paintings and statues. The painting is now in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Loesser suggested identifying the woman in the portrait as the poet Laura Battiferri, perhaps inspired by the monograph on Bronzino's life that Albertina Furno had published a few years before Loesser acquired the painting, which revealed the very close relationship between the woman and the painter. Like Battiferri, Bronzino was a poet, and the two exchanged many sonnets. Laura Battiferri, born in Urbino in 1523 and married to the sculptor Bartolomeo Ammannati, followed her husband to Florence in 1555, where she soon became part of the Florentine Literary Society and came in contact with Benedetto Varchi. You heard Dario Brancato speak about him earlier, and Benedetto Varchi was also Bronzino's friend and mentor. The moment of greatest, so to speak, media exposure of Laura Battiferri was the publication in print of her Libro Primo delle Opere Toscane in 1560. Bronzino's portrait is traditionally dated to this period. The confusion between Petrarch's Laura and Laura Battiferri is not simply a case of homonymy. Battiferri was celebrated in poetry by her contemporaries, who just juxtaposed the two figures by using the same repertoire of metaphors that Petrarch used for Laura, not least the assimilation of the woman to the mythical Daphne, the nymph loved by Apollo and transformed into a laurel, lauro in ancient Italian, to escape the god's lust. This alone shows how pervasive the Petrarchan model was in 16th century literature. To be born Laura in a century of Petrarchism was to bear the mark of predestination. But there is more. In a poetic portrait of Battiferri, Bronzino claimed that she was superior not only to Oretta and Bice, that is, to Petrarch's Laura and to Dante's Beatrice, as an inspirer of poetry, but also as a poet to the two poets Dante and Petrarch. The woman's prominent nose, which seemed to Neustreff to be a sign of aristocratic distinction, has scandalized more than one present-day critic. The most generous has called it an arresting profile. The cruelest has written that it makes her look like a haughty reptile completely devoid of human qualities. According to Bellosi, and this opinion is also shared by Carol Plazzotta and Vittoria Kirkham, Bronzino deliberately altered the features of Laura Battiferri to make her resemble Dante and associate her with the national poet of Florence. In short, the portrait of Laura Battiferri would be a hybrid, half a woman, the subject of poetry, and half a poet. This alone could be enough to make the painting compelling. But Bronzino seized the opportunity to comment on the portrait by sending a correspondence sonnet to Varchi. Correspondence sonnets were a very fashionable genre in the 16th century, the kind that challenges our romantic idea of lyric poetry as an expression of individuality. It takes two people to write a pair of correspondence sonnets, a sender, who sometimes imitates the style of the person to whom the sonnet is addressed, and the receiver, who is expected to respond using the same rhymes as the sender. In the sonnet on the portrait addressed to Varchi, Bronzino asked his friend for help as he was about to paint. The painter feared that he would not succeed in portraying Laura Battiferri because he was unable to withstand the woman's dazzling gaze. In reply, Varchi reassured Bronzino that he would stand between the painter and the sitter, averting her gaze so that Bronzino could look at the woman indirectly and safely and paint the portrait. One could speculate that the painter chose to portray Laura Battiferri in profile because he was inspired by Varchi's words. But the opposite is more likely, namely that Varchi conceived this response after seeing the finished painting with the profile pose. Indeed, Bronzino seems not to have been satisfied with his friend's answer, as he felt the need to compose a new sonnet himself on behalf of Varchi. That is the answer he would have liked to receive. In his reply on behalf of Varchi, Bronzino told himself that there was no need to be afraid. Far from being harmful, Laura's gaze was what would enable him to complete the portrait, as if to say that, for the painting to be successful, the active collaboration of the sitter, not just the painter's expertise, was needed to infuse her personality into the painting. This seems appropriate to our meeting today about multi-layered authorship, but there is even more. In the same answer on behalf of Varchi, Laura Battiferri is described as l'alma mia fiamma terna, terna meaning threefold. Now, in what sense is Laura Battiferri a threefold, a three-pointed flame of love? So the name Laura actually has three meanings. Firstly, the nymph Daphne, transformed into a laurel tree. And perhaps this is why the woman's body in the painting has a rigid vertical development, almost tree-like. The laurel is also the plant of poetry, represented in the portrait by the open book with Petrarch's sonnets. In the painting, the book is not a mere container of text, but, as is typical of Bronzino, it has the tangibility of a real object. Rather than being an accessory of the sitter, the book transcends the function of a symbolic attribute and comes to the fore as a co-protagonist of the painting. Finally, laurel leaves crown poets and emperors. Laurel is a symbol of victory, glory, and fame, to which I think the profile pose alludes, recalling that of medals bearing the effigies of illustrious women and men. Medals were very popular in the 15th and 16th century as a revival of antiquity. Now look at the painting, at the pose of the face, perfectly in profile, while the body is turned towards the observer. Look at the outline of the face, which stands out sharply against a gray background, and at its emotionless expression. Look at the shoulders, which fall abruptly, unnaturally, in contrast to the moving realism of the other details. In terms of shape and color, the upper part of the portrait could easily have been inscribed in a circle or an oval. This interpretation of the profile pose seems to me to be the most appropriate, because it draws on a figurative grammar and culture that must have been very much on Bronzino's mind. Dario Brancato has shown you the medal portraying Benedetto Varchi, but one need only think of the collection of cameos that are in the Medici treasure. Acknowledging the apparent visual reference to medals makes it possible to keep together the interpretation of the image of the woman and that of the text in the book. The two Petrarchan sonnets reproduced in the painting do not appear one after another, one after the other in Petrarch's collection of poems, and have never been paired together by critics. This painting is the first time they are placed side by side, clearly a deliberate choice. The first sonnet, number 64 in Petrarch's collection, is a text that refers back to an Ovidian antecedent, Epistola ex Ponto, second book, octave. In the Epistola, Ovid in exile thanks Cotta for sending him the image of the emperor, reproduced on a metal support, probably a coin or a medal. At first, the emperor's face seems to him to have a hostile expression, but as the poet speaks, he seems to nod and smile. It is, in short, a text in which Ovid enters into dialogue with an image. Petrarch's Sonnet 64 is a variation on this theme. The fact that it is based on the Epistola ex Ponto was already well known in the 16th century, as attested by one of the most popular commentaries on the Canzoniere, that is, the one by Alessandro Vellutello. By transcribing the text in the painting, Bronzino creates some kind of double bottom, a game of Chinese boxes, a portrait with a sonnet on it, which in turn echoes a poem about a portrait. Petrarch's second sonnet, number 240, is one of the rare instances, as Maria Luisa Doglio has pointed out, in which the poet praises Laura, not for her physical beauty, but for her ingenuity, a quality Petrarch usually attributes to himself. And for once, the poet gives the woman the floor in a fictional dialogue. It is a version of Petrarch who sees himself in Laura. What better sonnet for a portrait in which the sitter sums up the role of beloved woman and writer? It comes to mind that the profile portrait is archetypically the portrait of the beloved. Pliny recounts, and Benedetto Varchi and Giorgio Vasari repeat, that the invention of the art of painting is to be attributed to a young Greek woman in love who drew the outline of a lover's shadow on the wall as he was about to leave on a long journey. In addition, Bronzino and Varchi, in their exchange of correspondence sonnets on the portrait, explicitly quote a few lines from Petrarch's two texts, thus sneaking their way into the painting. A painting to which Bronzino, as painter and poet, Laura Battiferri, Benedetto Varchi, Dante, Petrarch, and Ovid all contributed. And it would be interesting to know who commissioned the portrait, to add yet another layer. I would like to end by repeating what Brad Nelson said in a preliminary meeting, that this painting celebrates the genius of a single exceptional person and at the same time deconstructs the idea of a solitary genius. Thank you.
That's a nice transition. Thank you, Paolo. And thank you, Dario, for putting this together. And thanks everyone who's taken some time out on this, this beautiful afternoon to hang out with us and here's some thoughts about authorship. The question of authorship in Cervantes is one that has gone in many different directions, in large part because of the attempt to explain the arguably progressive nature of many of Cervantes's characters, his plot lines, his attitudes towards religion, towards minority cultures. One of the first was the hypothesis that you could explain his departure from Counter-Reformation thoughts about race, about culture, about empire, about war, in the fact that or the possibility that he came from a converso family, right? This debate reaches a high point or apotheosis of sorts in the debates around how to read his last work, Los Trabajos de Persiles y Sigismunda, or the Trials of Persiles y Sigismunda, which can either be read as a Christian romance, as the author's last work and last gasp attempt to see himself in the light of Orthodox thought in Counter-Reformation Spain, or as an absolute parody of a Christian romance, and thus would be read in the absolute opposite direction. Another one of these would be trying to relate his generous and tolerant attitude toward the Morisco minority and his apparent critique of the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609 by Felipe III, and base that in the 5 years that he spent in captivity in Algiers, although one might think that he would have perhaps the opposite reaction to being a hostage in Algiers. Another one would be that is what appears to be a proto-feminist attitude towards female characters and the very critical representation of sexual violence in an aristocratic culture, in the fact that his sisters had very unfortunate experiences with noblemen who had promised to marry them and then abandoned them. An act which at the time is legally considered rape in that culture, as a matter of fact. But I'm going to sort of move. I just wanted to provide that as sort of a context for how far back and how broad the discussion of authorship related to Cervantes is before I focus on the writer himself. What I want to do is eventually show you some examples from both books of Don Quixote and show how he deconstructs modern and pre-modern notions of authorship and authority, authors as authorities, and discuss at the end, or perhaps more in the conversation at the end, how useful these passages and these frameworks can be for deconstructing our own experience in a culture which has sort of a hyper individualism or a hyper branding or an inflation of the sense of individuality, through social media or through branding, whether it's political or economic or media based or whatever. I'm going to start by reading a short passage that situates Cervantes in the culture of patronage, especially as it relates to the production of the false second volume of Don Quixote between Cervantes's first and second books. In The Writer Who Bought His Own Book, Juan Carlos Rodriguez argues convincingly that the source for Avellaneda's apocryphal continuation of Don Quixote is the literary circle that surrounded Lope de Vega, who is the most famous playwright, in fact, sort of the counterpart to Shakespeare in early modern Spain. And furthermore, that the apparent malice with which the anonymous author treats Cervantes' original arises from Lope's aristocratic aspirations. And I'll quote, Lope fully complies with the rules of the Lord-servant dialectic. That is why he admires and serves the lords, to the point of becoming immersed in them. But at the same time, he hates the great ones in his own sphere. He is not satisfied with being the first among parties, among equals, other writers, that is, but he always wants to be the first. Hence his rejection and aforementioned fear before poets like Góngora or Calderón. He fears them precisely because they can outpace him as a poet. They are like inverted images in the mirror of that power of the Lord or the lords that he carried so deep under his skin that he practically ends up imitating Góngora and Calderón, almost as in an act of vassalage. According to Rodriguez, Lope sees himself as a kind of artistic grande, who nevertheless felt threatened by the likes of Calderón and Góngora due to their rising currency in the courtly aesthetic economy. But the question that motivates Rodriguez's extended essay concerns why and how Cervantes fits into Lope's search for power and prestige. And I quote, Góngora and Calderón were great in and of themselves, hence, no doubt, the Lopean terror. But Cervantes? If Cervantes was nobody, why the resentment, the continuous and apparently inexplicable enmity against Cervantes, even attempting to annihilate him with the false Quixote, the one who emerged from his circle of power under the name of Avellaneda? To answer his questions, Rodriguez builds on much scholarship and many scholars who argue convincingly that Cervantes' former companion in arms, one Jerónimo de Pasamonte, who shows up in Don Quixote as Ginés de Pasamonte, wrote the apocryphal part 2 while Lope penned the prologue. Moving beyond the philological hypotheses, Rodriguez then situates his analysis within a materialistically founded methodology similar to Spadaccini and Talens, who write, quote, Cervantes sees the effect of the economic infrastructure on artistic values and the artist's integrity, and his dialogue with Lope de Vega and the public theater of his time may be read as an attempt to problematize those issues, end of quote. In other words, Cervantes' target is what José Antonio Maraval first identified as the subservient role of art and artist in a Baroque-guided culture directed by monarchical and seigneurial strata of Counter-Reformation society through a combination of patronage and censorship, something that Dario developed quite well in his presentation. And so I guess it's against this, right? So what Rodriguez argues in the end is Cervantes, because he can't find a patron, becomes the first modern author because he actually has to sell books. And so when the false Quixote comes out, it's a threat not only to his honor as an artist, as an author, but a threat to his pocketbook, since it's going to steal sales from him. Even though, of course, as we all know, copyright is a little slippery, and once you get your payment for the first edition, publishers are free to repeat and enrich themselves without acknowledging the author's work in the end. But anyway, we'll move through a number of quotes here, and I have a number of comments, again, to look at how Cervantes deconstructs authority and authorship, even as he tries to become a different kind of author. And maybe we can talk about the different model of authorship that Cervantes articulates by completely deconstructing the notion of the author that was handed to him and which informed his authorial decisions. So this is from the dedication, right, to the Duca Béjar, right? And it's a typical dedication, almost, right? Except he starts by saying, trusting in the protection and honor that your excellence extends to all kinds of books, mainly those that owing to their nobility do not submit themselves to the service and contentment of the uneducated, right? He starts with the uneducated, which in Spanish is the vulgo, right? It's worth noting that the Duca Béjar rejects this dedication. He wants nothing to do with this book or Cervantes's dedication. In large part, probably because the Duke of Béjar was a little bit afraid of the reaction of Lope de Vega to the work of Cervantes. And the term vulgo is directly related to Lope de Vega's type of art. Lope writes, he writes some that we know 900 plays that were performed, that we have extant now, and he says he wrote around 1,500, so he is the playwright of his period and a very influential figure. And he also wrote a manual called the New Art of Writing Plays, in which he talks about the need to satisfy the vulgo, right? And the vulgo that Lope's plays are satisfying are two different kinds of vulgo, because one is an uneducated audience, but his plays also satisfy the needs of a monarchical seigneurial system of privilege. And so vulgo can be read in two ways if you take like a sideways glance at it. And this may be one of the reasons that Cervantes has such trouble finding a patron. This continues in the prologue, right? And I'm going to read this because it's so much fun to read Cervantes, right? So this is the beginning of the first part of Don Quixote. Idle reader, without swearing to it, you can believe that I would have wanted this book, as a child of my understanding, to be the handsomest and most gallant and most ingenious that one could imagine. But I have not been able to contradict the natural order in which each thing engenders its likeness. And so what could my sterile and uncultivated wit bring to life but a story about a dry, shriveled up, capricious child, full of diverse thoughts, never imagined by anyone else, like someone born in a prison, where every annoyance has its place and where every gloomy noise makes itself at home. Tranquility, the pleasant place or location, the amenity of the fields, the serenity of the heavens, the murmuring of the fresh springs, the stillness of the soul, are necessary to turn even the most sterile muses fecund, bestowing offspring on the world, which they overfill with marvels and contentment. And he continues. It so happens that a man has an ugly son with no grace whatsoever, and the love that he has for him places a blindfold on his eyes so that he cannot see his faults. Indeed, he judges them for cleverness and charm and recounts them to his friends as witticism and subtleties. But I, although I seem to be his father, am the stepfather to Don Quixote. I do not want to follow the current of the times, nor beg you with tears in my eyes, as others do, dearest reader, to pardon or overlook the faults that you might see in this son of mine, nor are you related to him, nor his friend, and you have your soul and your body and your free will, like the best of them, and you are in your own home, where you are the lord and master, like the king over his taxes, and you know what is said so often, that under my cloak I kill the king, right? And so a number of things are happening here. I mean, there's the excessive attempt to attract the benevolence of the reader with the complete sort of aesthetic destruction of himself as an author and of his work in the first paragraph of the prologue. And then the second, something curious happens. He separates himself, and instead of being the father of this literary offspring, he is now the stepfather. Right? So he places a distance there, and this is quite new. But in the end, what is also quite powerful is that he empowers the reader in the end to have the ultimate say over his work, right? And of course, it's a very powerful and loaded refrain or proverb that he throws in here at the end as well. Under my cloak, I kill the king, right? And so this is the start of his deconstruction of authorial sort of privilege, because he'll go on in the prologue to complain to a friend who happens to walk in while he's struggling over this prologue, and he complains to the friend, well, I can't seem to finish this prologue. What should I do? And the friend says, you're being an idiot. Right? All you need to do is take a book like an abecedario, which is an ABC list of famous quotations, and start throwing them in, right? So, like, if you have a giant, call him Goliath, right? If there's a powerful man with a powerful arm, call him Zeus, right? Just start throwing in these, these sort of medieval and classical references to pump up your supposed erudition, right? And so he pulls the tool of erudition out from underneath the author, right? The prologue is supposed to do the opposite, right? The prologue is supposed to enhance your view of the author so that you're going to believe everything that comes later in the book. And Cervantes is doing the opposite. And this reaches a climax in the dedicatory poems, which his friend tells him to just make up. And so Cervantes just makes up, right? Poems, dedicatory poems, from Sancho to Dulcinea, right? Fictional characters. I think my favorite is the sonnet from Babieca, El Cid's horse, to Rocinante, right? So a horse writes a sonnet to Don Quixote's nag there. And so this is sort of the beginning of the deconstruction of authority. It continues right away in the first book, when whichever voice is speaking now, it may be the same voice as in the prologue, but perhaps not. They'd like to say that he had the last name of Quijada or Quesada, speaking of Don Quixote, since in this matter there's some difference in the authors who write about the case. Although by plausible conjectures, one is left to understand that he called himself Quejana. But this is of little importance to our story. It is enough that in its narration, one doesn't stray one bit from the truth. This follows on the fact that we don't know his age. We don't know his name. We don't know exactly where he lives. But as long as the story doesn't stray one bit from the truth, it doesn't matter, right? And so we have this, again, a parody of now historical authority by referring to some historians, right, who have written about Don Quixote. Okay, and so now we have multiple authors in the novel. Okay, and keep in mind that this is the story of a man who goes crazy reading too many books, right? And then imposes his vision on those around him. And then those around him have to decide whether they're going to go along with this or not. And it's not always an easy decision, right? Another example occurs in part 1 in chapter 8, right? And this starts a whole nother angle on authority and authorship, right? So Don Quixote's having a battle. He's picked a fight, basically, with a Basque on the road, trying to get the Basque to swear to Dulcinea's beauty. The Basque has never seen Dulcinea, and so he's a little hesitant. But Don Quixote says he needs to swear to this without seeing it, right? If we think of this in political terms, this is a super powerful moment, right? You're being asked to swear to something you've never seen, being threatened with a sword, okay? The worst part is at this very moment, and you can see both gentlemen have their swords in the air. At this very moment in Terminus, the author of this story leaves the battle hanging, excusing himself by saying that he couldn't find anything else written about Don Quixote's feats, other than the ones already related. It is very true that the second author of this work refused to believe that such a strange story could have been handed over to the laws of oblivion, or that the ingenious wits of La Mancha had been so incurious that there would be no papers in their archives or in their desks about this famous knight. And so with these thoughts in his head, he did not despair of finding the end of this enjoyable story, which, thank the favorable heavens, he found in the manner that will be told in the second part. And so in the second part, whichever author this is, finds a man, overhears someone laughing in a marketplace reading through some papers, right, that are being sold in Arabic, no less, right, about Dulcinea having the best hand for salting pork in all of La Mancha, right? And so this author buys the manuscript. He hires a Morisco translator to translate it from the Arabic into Spanish. And so the entire novel of Don Quixote, this famous piece of literature, sort of the icon of Castilian, right, turns out to be a translation from the Arabic by a Moorish, written by a Moorish historian, Cide Amete Benengele. No, and so there are so many layers, and I have 5 or 6 more slides, but I'm going to end it here because I'm also going over time. But each example problematizes and complicates even more the idea of authorship, right? Following on very, very closely what Dario was saying about layers, right? In addition to layers, it's different perspectives, right? Each author introduces a point of view and removes the reader's security, right, around the idea that what they're reading is real, and reminding them that they're reading fiction all the time, right? Because you forget you're reading fiction when you're in it, right? Cervantes never allows you to forget that you're reading fiction, right? And these boxes that he uses for authorship, he uses them to explore themes of racism, themes of sexism, sexual violence, religious violence, in ways that are very ironic, and of course, ambivalent, because also, as Paulo explained very well, and Dario as well, the Inquisition has a very heavy hand here, right? And it's only by selling or presenting his work as a ridiculous, laugh-inducing farce, right, can Cervantes come to the conclusions and show us the boxes in which our prejudices, our stereotypes are contained, so that we can remove ourselves from those boxes and take a critical view on the world around us. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, so, okay, good. The slides are coming up. So I'm going to jump a few centuries into the future, and I would like to thank Dario for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I work on representations of 18th and 19th century European art music, in particular, kind of the place of gossip and anecdote and fiction in how we talk about composers' lives. So very kind of slippery and unreliable sources. And I'm currently in the early stages of a book on the reception history of the 18th and early 19th century composer and teacher Antonio Salieri, and the role of kind of fiction and rumor and kind of sensationalism in how Salieri has historically been talked about as Mozart's rival, and to a lesser extent as the composition teacher of Schubert and Beethoven, among several other people. And today I'm going to be talking about a piece of somewhat obscure late 19th century short fiction about Salieri, as it turns out, and thinking about how this short story from 1873 reimagines things that would have been commonplace in the actual world of 18th century opera as plagiarism and as a sort of musical crime, and how I'm arguing that this kind of fiction, of which there was a fair amount in 19th century European magazines and other publications, really shows how notions of musical authorship and authority and creativity changed from the late 18th century to the late 19th century, and has had staying power in more recent fictions and semi-fictions about composers and musicians. So I will start. So the story I'm talking about is George Walter Thornbury's The Old Chapel Master, which was published in the Belgravia Christmas Annual for 1873. This was a magazine edited by the sensation novelist Mary Elizabeth Braddon, the author of Lady Audley's Secret, and kind of in the tradition of Victorian ghost stories for Christmas. So we have three main characters: student who wants to become an opera composer, Karl Waldstein, his elderly composition teacher, Herr Zadaka, and Zadaka's daughter and assistant, Lisa, who becomes Karl's fiancée. And this is a short story published in 4 even shorter chapters, and it becomes apparent in the second half of the story that Zadaka has some kind of secret related to his youth in Vienna. And at a celebration following the first rehearsal for Karl's opera, Romeo and Juliet, a stranger appears and accuses Zadaka of having murdered Mozart back in the past, some unknown number of decades ago, and accuses him of being the supposedly disgraced Antonio Salieri living under a new name. And Zadaka falls ill and is taken home, and he confesses to Karl that he did in fact envy Mozart and plotted against him, and in fact plagiarized some of his works after his death, but denies the charge of murder, saying, "I have sinned deeply, but I have also repented deeply." And then at the end of the story, Zadaka dies speaking with Mozart's ghost, while in the next room, Karl and Lisa play a piano four hands arrangement of Mozart's Requiem. And the image you see on the left there is the sole engraving that was published with the story by Kristin. And it's a scene early on in the story where Karl and Zadaka are standing in the organ loft in the church. And Zadaka is, "Oh, don't you see this figure? There's someone here, there's someone here." And later on, Karl doesn't see anything. And later on, we learn that this is supposedly Mozart's ghost who's sort of following Zadaka around. But today I want to focus on one particular quote from the final chapter of the story, and this is Zadaka's confession to Karl, where he describes his youth in Vienna and his rivalry with Mozart, and his eventual decision to commit plagiarism. So he describes in a very anachronistic and not at all accurate to how either Mozart or Salieri historically worked scenario where these two men are classmates at conservatory and kind of engaged in what seems to be a friendly competition with each other for various prizes and positions before it turns to genuine rivalry. And Zadaka tells Karl, quote, "Still keeping his friendship, I raised secret intrigues to drive him from Vienna, where I dreaded his rivalry. I was ambitious, and despair made me long for his death. I see now my great wickedness, and how near to murder the devil led me." Thanks. "He sank, and in almost his last hours, he gave me the fatal gift of 2 unfinished operas, the works of his youth. Again I was tempted and fell. I set up openly as an imitator of my dead friend and wove into my opera the airs which I had stolen and completed. My success at first was great. Duplicates of 2 airs I had used were found at Magdeburg, and my secret was discovered. Then came that terrible rumor, and I changed my name and fled," end quote. So in what time remains, I want to connect this, the depiction of musical plagiarism and creation in this quote to kind of the historical realities of late 18th century opera buffa as a collaborative art. I also want to connect the narrative of kind of envy and plagiarism and uncertain authorship in the 19th century fictional world with readings and debates that occurred surrounding actual late 18th century works. And I ultimately want to ask, both here in the discussion and in my broader project on Salieri reception history, what does this kind of imagined musical crime represent about changing notions of originality and ownership? And I would add here, thinking of the other papers, also changing notions of authorship. And what does the wholly invented image of plagiarism do to the various other layers of myth-making surrounding the historical figure of Salieri? So while Thornbury depicts the insertion of arias in part or in whole by Mozart into the fictional Salieri's operas as cause for scandal, there were, in fact, several legitimate reasons in the second half of the 18th century why an opera might contain works by multiple composers or drawing from multiple works. These include such practices as the so-called suitcase arias, where singers, famous singers who would travel to perform with different theaters in different cities, would sort of insist upon a particular kind of aria, or in some cases, a specific work to sing, regardless of the context. So in the early 18th century, there was a particular castrato who was active in London who insisted that he always needed to enter his first scene riding a horse. And it did not matter if the opera itself had no need for there to be a horse or some kind of battle scene or whatever. Like, this was how he had to make his entrance. So sometimes these things were dictated by performers rather than the composers. There's also extensive archival evidence of musical recycling and self-borrowing and parody in the genres of opera in which both Mozart and Salieri were working in the 1780s. The most famous example of this is probably the banquet scene in Don Giovanni, where short excerpts from a number of contemporary operas are referenced, with the character of Leporello even commenting on a reference to a different opera by Mozart. And there were also a vibrant practice of pastiche and parody, where references to well-known composers and poets and singers would be combined to create a plot parodying operatic conventions. So things like the musical Bee, which was a pastiche referencing a number of singers who were active in Vienna in the middle of the 1780s, as well as a scene in Salieri's Prima la Musica, where two singers show up to audition for a new opera and sing arias by other composers. There are also, at this time, deliberately multi-author works, so co-authored works where different composers are collaborating, but also the practice of publishing variations and arrangements of things that people would recognize, sort of cashing in on popular tunes, as it were. And all of this was sort of accepted within the artistic milieu of the 1780s. By contrast, when we get into the 19th century, as the notion of authorship, as everybody mentioned on the panel, as the notion of authorship and musical creation moves towards kind of the single author genius working alone mentality, you have the notion of musical authorship becoming quite fraught. And in particular, in the case of Mozart, his last work, the Requiem, is really a site of debate in the early and mid 19th century, because it was unfinished or completed by other people, and because there was this great anxiety about this work that was seen as having such biographical power. I mean, a composer dying while writing a mass for the dead has a great deal of kind of quasi-supernatural import on how that biography is told. But then what does it mean for an audience or critics or a biographer if some part of the Requiem that audiences find particularly moving turns out to not actually be by Mozart? What is the kind of artistic integrity of this work? And what also are the moral issues surrounding how the work was completed? And I'm referencing here in particular Simon Keefe's recent book on 19th century Mozart and Haydn reception history, where kind of very, I want to say sterile, but very dry documentary readings of Mozart's manuscripts were sort of merged with kind of quasi-supernatural and sometimes outright supernatural readings of the Requiem as a sort of portent of death. And Frederick Ries's dissertation on musical forgery, where he talks about how the fact that one can read the Requiem as a forgery has had a real impact in how people have talked about Mozart's widow, Constanza, and his assistant, Franz Süssmayr, and kind of their contributions to forging this work. Thornbury himself, the author of The Old Chapel Master, was interested in forgery, although his other publications are more tied to famous British instances of literary and artistic forgery. So he wrote an essay for, I believe, for Charles Dickens's magazine All the Year Round on the forger and writer and alleged serial killer, Griffiths Wainwright. This work, The Old Chapel Master, as a piece of sensation fiction, kind of ties into a kind of literary fascination with forgery as a secret crime in Victorian society. So sensation fiction is a genre of 19th century British fiction. If you think of like Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone or The Woman in White, this sort of combination of what we might think today of horror and crime fiction, where you have characters with secret identities, where kind of sensational crimes are revealed to have taken place in their past. So I also want to quickly point out, kind of in connection with my broader project, that The Old Chapel Master, while a very strange example of fiction about Salieri with its supernatural elements and crime drama, is not unique. There are some superficial and not so superficial plot similarities to a much earlier novella, Gustav Nicolai's The Enemy of Music from 1835. There's kind of a parallel love story and role of a mentor figure. And very curiously, both of our student protagonists have names that evoke Beethoven. So Nicolai's protagonist is named Ludwig. Thornbury's Karl Waldstein suggests the Waldstein Sonata by Beethoven, and both works end with the teacher confessing to having been Mozart's enemy and then dying. There are also a couple of potential biographical references to Salieri's actual biography as understood in this period. There's mention that Zadaka has moved from writing opera to focusing on religious music. There's a narrative of his teaching career as a kind of moral atonement for his past theatrical intrigues. And this, while not documented in the biographical primary sources for Salieri, this was a very common 19th century understanding of his life. So in particular, biographers of Schubert, one of his students, would point to Salieri's mentorship of Schubert as a kind of atonement for having supposedly impeded Mozart's career. So while this piece of fiction is absurd as biography, Salieri died in 1825, having received full honors from the Habsburg court, and in fact was retired following his hospitalization on his full pay. There was no sort of big scandal or any known plagiarism. And it would be really easy to sort of say, this is historically inaccurate, and it's wrong, and it's just ludicrous. But I would argue instead that it reveals something about how certain kinds of historical or rumored historical details move from the world of fact, kind of through rumor, to the world of fiction, and how things that were considered perfectly normal compositional practices back in the 18th century change across into and across the 19th century. So by the time Thornberry is writing, we're seeing ideas like Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea of total artwork associated with Wagner's writing, where the composer is responsible not only for the music, but also the text of an opera and the costumes and the staging, and the conflating of what initially in the rumors about Salieri were sort of vague intrigues against some of his colleagues to rumors of specific crimes. And in the case of Thornberry, kind of conflating the rumors of Mozart's supposed murder with the idea of stealing opera arias. And the idea that one could steal music in a pre-recording culture also reflects this way in which romantic musicologists and biographers and novelists really struggled with the notion that music had both this ineffable quality of, we hear it and it sort of lingers in our memory, but is otherwise gone, and a physical form of a manuscript that can, in fact, perhaps be stolen and misattributed or reattributed. So I want to thank you again, reiterate the thanks for sharing your Friday afternoon with us, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. So I think we can start our conversation. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience, the people on Zoom. No questions so far. So I'll break the ice, and I'll ask one question to Brad. First of all, thank you all for participating. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Kristin. So Brad, you mentioned a deconstruction of authority by this constant reference to truth in the prologue. And this is, it echoes with the practice of historians that, would actually be concerned with finding the truth. But, I'd like for you, I would ask you to elaborate more on this aspect. Because, the effect that the author, that Cervantes has, is like the opposite of what historians are seeking, which is, people, readers, believe them.
Yeah, I think that, one argument could be that he's trying to construct a different kind of reader, right? One that is more aware of how truths are constructed, right? Truth does not come to us unmediated. Right, and I think that, and this goes back in Spain to at least the Catholic kings, right? Isabel la Católica was famous for having hired chroniclers to rearrange the dynastic history of Trastamara family to, justify the fact that she's on the throne, when in fact she probably wasn't the next in line to the throne, right? And I don't think they were inventing anything, but I think that what Cervantes is trying to show there is that there are interested parties, right, that are constructing these truths, that a critical reader shouldn't be accepting at face value, right, what they're reading on the page, and he performs really how as you showed very clearly in your talk and in the slides, that these histories that seem to be univocal, right, when they're read and when they're published, in fact, are multilingual in and of themselves, right? And that this multivocality is something that the reader should become aware of and be able to judge critically, right? So that we don't just, the Habsburg kings at the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, doing the same exact thing to justify the expulsion of the Moriscos, right? By erasing them from history, right? And I think that the nobility had been doing the same thing in their so-called green books going back into the 15th century to erase all Jewish lineage from their family histories, right? And so historical revisionism was the normal practice at the time, right? And the results of this historical revisionism were the erasure, right, of legitimate inhabitants, right? Legitimate political actors, legitimate economic actors and subjects, right? And this doesn't even approach, right, Cervantes's reframing of sexual violence in early modern Spain, right? And I think that, the figure of Lope de Vega is very important because it's a constant dialogue, right? And where Lope acts as sort of his plays justify the role of the nobility and their use of sexual violence to perpetuate their power, right? And of course to erase the power of women altogether and the voices of women altogether, right? When Cervantes reveals this and reveals Lope's the compromised nature of his art, right, with relation to the aristocracy and by extension a little bit the church as well, the reaction is quite violent from Lope, and the reaction of Lope's patrons is simply silence, not supporting Cervantes, right? And so, truth is very volatile for Cervantes, right? Truth is not in the text. The truth is how the text is put together. The truth is how the sources are both used and how their origins are erased, right? In the manner of presenting truths. And I think that his practice can be very powerful today, perhaps not even today, but especially today, right? When we're watching, not just in the US, right? But in Canada as well, legislative attempts to silence certain approaches to history, critical race theory, gender studies, the disappearance of offices of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are bills in 28 different states in the US, right? And they're trying to rewrite history by erasing what it is that we humanists do every day, which is to try to complicate the realities around us by giving voice, right, to those voices that have been erased by the very, practices that we've all been talking about today. So thanks for the question.
Again, thank you for the answer. It's a very interesting what you just mentioned, complicating the reality. But I'll get back to that in a second, because I wanted to ask Kristin. I really like how you portrayed the transition from forgery that became sort of a crime in the 19th century, which is completely opposite to the practices, the performing practices of those times. Could you say something more about, for example, you mentioned about the performers dictating, which is sort of the opposite of what Brad or Paolo and myself talked about, which is usually the patrons that would impose certain themes or certain a certain direction. Could you say something more about this practice of performers dictating specific requests, etc.? I know you talked about the castrato. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so this is something that it starts a bit before my time period, in the High Baroque, in sort of the late 17th century. But as you're getting a sort of international theatrical network in various parts of Europe, where you're getting, in particular, Italian language opera being performed in kind of major urban centers in multiple regions and nations, you're able to have these situations where foreign artists are hired from elsewhere to come and join a company for a season or sing in a particular production. And it's tied often to public theater networks as well. So these are people who sometimes they were invited by patrons, by courts to perform as well. But it is kind of tied to an emerging notion of musical celebrity, that you have performers that can command international fame and audiences. And of course, thinking about folks like Mozart and Salieri, this is what initially makes the Mozart family famous, right? Is that the children, Wolfgang and Nanel, as very young children, are touring Europe as child prodigies. And so, you're getting this kind of across the 18th century, that musicians, performers can be famous. You also have a context, particularly in Italian language opera, both serious and comic, where there are kind of accepted plot conventions and character types. And so it's very dramatically and musically easy to sort of remove one aria, one solo song that maybe didn't work so well at the premiere, or the singer wants to perform something else, doesn't like it or whatever, and insert a new piece and still have it make sense with the that singer's character that they're portraying and the overall plot of the opera. So the theatrical conventions of 18th century Italian opera really make this possible in a way it wouldn't be so possible in the 19th century, as there's changes in kind of how operatic scenes happen and how plots and characters develop away from some of these more standard types.
All right. Thank you. So, questions?
I just thought I'd follow up with Kristin and maybe Dario as well, and think about the concept of plagiarism, or the act of plagiarism, as a kind of murder of the author, right? And maybe also when you were talking about this sensation fiction, right? It was reminding me of reality shows, and the term reality fiction popped into my head at that point, because you're talking about real historical characters, and yet, you know, they're making up things, and at the root of it seems to be, at least in part, right, a desire to safeguard perhaps the economic potential of, you know, these works, right? Because that is not, that can't be placed out of context either, especially in the 19th century, you know, with the rise of capitalism, right? Because Cervantes is very aware of that fact, of the role of money in even in the production of art, right? I mean, he and Sancho are constantly negotiating, right? Sancho's supposed vassalage, but it turns into like a financial contract between the two of them, right? And so anyway, those are some of my thoughts, right? Plagiarism is murder, sensation fiction is reality fiction, and sort of the financial or economic factors at play, because we haven't talked a lot. You didn't mention that a lot, but to me, and perhaps it's, you know, it's just our current existence as well, and how important the financial part is. But those are sort of the three thoughts that I wonder if you wanted to elaborate on a little bit.
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts. I'll try to make them more streamlined. So yeah, the notion, I'll start with the money thing, because it's something that crops up in a lot of the kind of 19th century fictions about music and musical biography, and it's kind of a recurring myth in fiction about Mozart. I mean, if you've seen the movie Amadeus, sort of the depiction of, you know, Mozart as bad with money is kind of a recurring trope that historically is far more complicated, but fits well with 19th century ideas of the great artist, you know, shouldn't have to deal with such things. And it strikes me that it's a real problem for 19th century kind of romantic and proto-romantic authors who are grappling with positioning Mozart as a sort of solo great artist, you know, grappling with the fact that Salieri's operas were more financially successful in the 1780s. And in the kind of literary fictionalization of Salieri, you get this problem too, where there really isn't much documentation for an actual rivalry between them, beyond the fact that they were both kind of working in the same industry at the same time. And so you have multiple authors who have to invent kind of secret motives and secret crimes that Salieri, you know, is supposedly committing against Mozart. So if not murder, then, you know, plotting to make his operas fail. And if not that, then, well, he was just extremely jealous anyway. And I think this invented plagiarism that we find in Thornberry fits into that, okay, well, I'm not going to say it was murder, but it was kind of, you know, in this story, a kind of artistic murder or artistic crime. And one thing I'm realizing I didn't mention that makes the quote I read particularly musically absurd is that Zadaka claims in this confession that he either was given by Mozart on his deathbed or stole the manuscripts to two complete operas that Mozart had supposedly written in his youth. And the notion of someone writing an opera in, you know, the 1760s or 1770s without a librettist, without a commission, without singers, without a theater, you know, just for the sheer artistic joy of it, I guess, and carrying them around throughout his life is just like ridiculous to begin with. And I'm wondering if, to some extent, if the ridiculousness isn't also part of the point, like part of the sensation drama, that you have, it's not just something like Amadeus or like Alexander Pushkin's Mozart and Salieri, where you have kind of secret psychological rivalry going on, but you also have ghosts and theft and all of these like layer on layer on top of drama. Like it really does feel kind of reality TV-ish, that like this story, the big reveal of Zadaka's crime in this story would not have the same emotional effect if it was revealed that he was secretly some fictional composer who had like plotted against his equally fictional rival. Like the notion that it's, the reveal is that it's Mozart and Salieri makes this kind of emotionally and historically compelling, I think, to readers who might have been familiar with some of these things through other fictions or through kind of popular biography in the 1870s. So thanks.
Do you mind? Paolo, I wonder if you'd mind talking a little bit about, I don't know if you can call it a genre, the portrait of the female artist in the Renaissance. I don't know if this is a rarity, if this is something that happens, we're just not aware of it. And then I'm wondering in the portrait itself, because at least in the Spanish tradition, I don't think it's just the Spanish tradition, but female artists are often portrayed as incredibly unique, as sort of not even barely of their gender, right? Because they're so unique, and one might argue that there's an attempt to masculinize visually, right, the female poet in this case, and I'm just wondering if what maybe there have been things written on it, or maybe you have your own thoughts on that. But I'll leave the question there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this question. So I would say that the thing about women writers and women artists in this time and period is extraordinary and common at the same time. Like for instance, there's Virginia Cox has devoted a very important book about women writers in the 16th century. And she also challenged some stereotypes that were still going on through Italian literature history or European literature history, as if like the presence of the church had stopped women from participating in the literary society. And the thing that I guess with also Dario Brancato and other people who I guess we were just wondering in a recent seminar about Laura Battiferri, but I would say that the thing is much more common than that, is that it seems to be this sort of fashion in the Italian Renaissance and in Italian courts to have women writers, like some sort of demand and need. So I would say that most of the time we just interpret these exceptional figures as capable of imposing themselves onto the public, for sure. But at the same time, there's what we were thinking and we were wondering is how much so many people contributed to their fame and to their presence, as if to their presence on stage, as if they were needed and as if they were demanded. Like I think of Laura Battiferri, who was the wife of a famous sculptor who was very well inserted at court, and so she was in a way pushed in front. And not only Bronzino makes this portrait, and Bronzino is the court painter, but also Varchi, as Dario Brancato very well knows, creates an entire songbook about Laura Battiferri. And also the Duchess of Florence is the dedicatee of the poem. And for the first time, a woman poet dedicates her book to the Duchess first and the Duke in second place. So there's this way of genderizing this sort of relationship. And on the other hand, about the masculinization of this, there's also this famous quote about Vittoria Colonna that Michelangelo wrote, and that is that Vittoria Colonna is a man inside a woman, and then it says, nay, it's a god inside of a woman. So I would say that for sure, in some ways, one could argue that the very idea of writing was maybe considered to be a male activity that could be made by women, but in a way that it was different at the same time was wearing another identity. So that's what I found also compelling about Laura Battiferri, that can interpret both roles as the lover and the beloved, the poet and the subject of poetry. So for sure, I guess it's really, really interesting, this kind of time, and it's really compelling how there's so much work around it, that it's not just a matter of genius of female writers, but also how many people are converging towards them and helping them and discussing with them and pushing them on the front of the stage. But if I may, I also have a question for Kristin, because thinking about the reception of Salieri, I'm wondering how much the reception of Salieri is indebted with the reception of Mozart, since I guess that when you create a hero, then you have to create a villain too. And so Salieri is the perfect villain in this kind of story. Like I'm still thinking about 16th century panorama and how much the myth of Michelangelo helped to also help the artists to be recognized as intellectuals, or the work of art as intellectual work. And how much also this, I would say that the Vasari, for instance, uses Michelangelo as the sort of ramming instrument to deliver artists from the idea that they are mechanical people, but they are actually intellectual. But it's also a force that some people have to recognize. For instance, the censors inside the church, there were a few cardinals and bishops that tried to imagine some sort of index of works of arts, just like an index of books. And the main challenge that they found is that after the presence of Michelangelo, the inventions of Michelangelo, this was much more difficult. Like they write in some dialogues things like, it was such a beautiful time when we were in Egypt, and Egypt never changed the way of making arts for 1,000 years. And Middle Ages art was so easy to understand and to control. And I wish we could go back to to the time before Michelangelo was born. So even though they're not, praising Michelangelo in this way, it's still some sort of force, an individual that they have to recon in a context where art is still also building up on the example of antiquity, of classical art. And so I'm just wondering how much the myth of Mozart helped and was created through the 19th century, and and how much this reflects on the myth of Salieri.
Yeah, this is great. It's fascinating as you were talking about sort of the impact of Michelangelo's fame and public kind of recognition. A number of the early fictional depictions of Mozart and Salieri from the 1830s actually reference Michelangelo as sort of a forebearer of artistic greatness, and someone whose name has been remembered through the ages. And so it is interesting how like the visual arts do get tied to some of these kind of mythologizing writings about music history. And yes, yeah, the construction of Salieri as a literary villain is very, very tied to the mythologizing of Mozart, and the idea, the reading of Mozart's life as a kind of quasi-fiction, where you'll get short stories that are ostensibly focused on Mozart's tours as a child prodigy, where in the story he isn't actually depicted as an adult, but there'll be some kind of premonition of an early death and these sorts of things. Even in works where Salieri isn't a character at all. But it's also interesting that these things vary. The further you get from Salieri's death in 1825, the more kind of extreme the mythologizing gets, and also the further you get from Vienna. So in Paris, for example, in the 1820s, Salieri's operas, some of them were still being performed in Paris. So the written references to the rumors surrounding Mozart and Salieri, the French journalists are very dismissive of this rumor because, of course, Salieri is the composer of our great tragic opera Les Danaïdes, so why would he need to be jealous of anybody? Where in London and in Leipzig, where Salieri's operas were no longer presented, or if so, presented in very loose translations, the myth-making kind of happens more rapidly there and happens through both journalism and fiction. So yeah, it's very kind of historically and geographically distributed, how the myths and rumors spread, and then how they find their way into different kinds of writing about music. Because by the time you get to the early 20th century, where you start having like very strange, like detective, like crime fiction about Mozart's death, it's almost completely removed from any kind of biographical or philosophical claim, the way these things were often told in the 19th century. So very, very strange.
I wanna ask Dario a couple of questions, and we're getting towards the end, and so I think it's only appropriate we give him the last word on the event that he put together. So I have three questions, and they're not really even that related, but you. So you said that Cosimo de' Medici helped edit his own history, right? And at the same time, you started your talk by saying that these histories are not propaganda. And so I want to hear a little bit more about that, because when I think about the Spanish kings and their histories, I have a hard time separating the two. But that's only the first question. So the second question is, how much do we know about what the Inquisition redacted from, what the censors redacted from those histories? And number three, given the important role of the Inquisition in censoring these works, can we consider the Inquisition legitimately a co-author of almost all literature from the 15th to the 17th century? Anyway, I'll stop there.
All right, these are very, very appropriate questions that probably would take me another hour to answer, but I'll try to keep it nice and short. So we need to understand what let's say secular censorship meant and what religious censorship meant, and the two aspects oftentimes would not dialogue one with another, especially when Cosimo was alive, and less so when he died. But still, there was a conflict between secular authority and religious authority. They would rub elbow one against another, and at some point, to the point of delaying willingly the publication of works, because they would have to wait, and there was even a legal battle on who would have to have the last word on, say, imprimatur, so it can be printed. So let's start with the first question. How did Cosimo not implement propaganda? Because if we look at the parts that he redacted, he focused on three things. First of all, he would remove all the elements that would be considered as taking the narrative astray. So there are several parts of Varchi's history in particular where he talks about he focuses on micro events or minor obscure characters, and this it would be novellas added to the main thread of history. And so, they would not be necessary to the narrative, the straight narrative. And so he would not alter the course of history, he would not change dates or anything. He would just remove those elements that would be considered like, too fiction-like. So they're not necessary. Secondly, he would remove elements that would talk about like, close politics. Let's say, we have a meeting with the dean and we don't want the details of this meeting to be public, okay? So we redact them from the minutes because, these are like private conversations that are a bit too sensitive. And thirdly, like all the decisions for some reason that were taken, they would report, for example, decisions made at a higher upper religious level, so conclaves, etc. Again, they would be removed. Now, when the Inquisition steps in and when the Inquisition becomes more powerful than the secular power, that is, we can appreciate that with Amirato's history, then they start censoring every single instance when, for example, the morality of a pope is questioned, the morality of a religious person is questioned, or even when, for example, the historian talks about theological matters. A historian should not talk about historical matters. Now, how do we know this? Because there is an archive of the Inquisition. So, like you pull out the dossier about Amirato, and you have about like 8 pages of like point by point, like bullet points. This point needs to be redacted. This point because, and like for each point there is a reason. And for that passage where I show you like all the stars, it was actually a part where the inquisitor said, no, it has to be removed from history. But normally, and again, I'll go back to secular versus religious censorship. The secular censorship would do some kind of in-house, like pre-printing, sort of, preemptive censorship. And so they would eliminate all the passages that the reader would find, they would not be suitable for the readers. And this is, why it becomes kind of complicated. But anyway, I hope I answered your questions. The last one about
Censors, co-authors.
could censors be considered co-authors? In the case of like secular censors, yes, by all means, because they influenced, the way the work was put together and the way the work was published. In case of the Inquisition, we have fewer instances because the religious power was not as strong, and in many cases you don't have you have probably a handful of passages that were removed from these histories. But what is true is that they contributed to shape a vision of these historians that is. That still sticks to today's. It's like it's become almost a commonplace. All right. So I don't know if there are other questions from the audience.
Are there any questions from the audience? We can bring a microphone over if you have one. Gotta have one.
All right. Then I think we can wrap the. No? Sorry? No question. Question from the audience?
No? One last question? We can do it. We got time.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we got one. Hold on. We're just gonna bring a mic over. 1 second.
Hi, Dario, question. The censors in your manuscripts have left their traces. including the big long passage, which the Inquisition, you said, did. Why didn't they remove that as well and erase the traces? And the reason why I ask this is because it makes the text more proliferative. It makes it more plural and brings it in, which seemingly is ironically against their very goal of going towards a unitary truth. And it makes you, a reader, an embracer of the text, i.e. in Barthes's term, you get born because they decided to try to erase what an author was doing.
Well, that has to do with the circulation of works, manuscript versus printed. So for manuscript circulation, there was more tolerance. And so, in other words, the copy, the actual copy that is censored remained with the patron, with the patron's family. And the copy that was destined for manuscript circulation was the redacted copy. So for Varkey's history, there are about 150 manuscripts that were produced in the 17th century only. I think, no other historical work enjoy the same fame at a manuscript level. So, but there was also more tolerance towards the work that were circulated in manuscript form. In fact, when the work was printed in 1721, everything changed, and people started to worry that, such a printed work would cast a negative light on, some members of, Italian dynasties. For example, the Farnese family. There's a very infamous episode at the end of Varkey's history about, a rape of a bishop that was raped by the Pope's son. So imagine, how. And so the descendant of this first Duke of Parma bought as many copies as possible, trying to remove these two last pages from this book, materially. And so if you go to the libraries today and you look for a copy of an 18th century copy of Varkey's history, you find that some copies have the last two pages and some copies don't. But circulation, manuscript circulation, was much more flexible in terms of that.
They don't have the big star page.
No. Because, sometimes if you really wanted to censor something, you just, put a layer of ink, and so you make it illegible.
If I understand correctly, the stars come after the book was probably printed the first time.
Yeah.
And so that redaction was made after the book was already published.
And so, they actually stopped.
And so, anyway.
Yeah, they stopped the press and they made them reprint those pages with the stars. So the page, the form had already been composed, and there was a last minute change. They said, no. You have to put stars here. But it was too late to reformat the whole book. So instead they put the stars. I think we went over our time. So, but thank you very much for joining us and for everything. And thank you for the fourth space.
Thank you so much, Dario, Paolo, Kristin, Brad. Thank you all for coming in. Everyone in the audience, everyone joining us on Zoom, online. Thanks for coming, and for your question. Thank you for that too. And just going to let you know that we're going to be closing up the Zoom. We're going to close up the live stream now, Paolo. We're going to say goodbye to you.
Okay.
Just a reminder that this remains available on our YouTube channel. So revisit it, share it, all of that. And the next more important thing to do is to have a fantastic weekend. All right.